philosophy of law. The module is entitled Critiques of Human Rights. The objectives of this module are to discuss the main philosophical critiques to the idea of human rights. This module was authored by Alex Cistelecan from the Petru Maior University in Romania. I'm Akash Singrator from Lewis University in Rome. The critiques of human rights were born at the same moment that human rights were born. So precisely in the 18th century, when we heard declarations of human rights, for example, in the French Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen, there was simultaneously a critique of this conception of natural right. The critiques that have been forwarded since the 18th century till today have taken on numerous different forms and modalities that basically depend upon the historical context and the political philosophical position of the authors of those critiques. So we're going to discuss a wide range of these kinds of critiques, different philosophical positions over a historical period that spans from the 18th century to today. So the first critiques of human rights came precisely during the articulation of those rights. For example, in 1789, when the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen were espoused in the process of the French Revolution, the greatest critic of that revolution, the conservative statesman Edmund Burke, authored a book criticizing not only the revolution in France, but also in the philosophical ideas supporting that revolution. And specifically, he criticized the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. His argument was that this declaration was both arrogant and too abstract to be meaningful. The arrogance idea is related to Edmund Burke's conservatism. So Burke's conservative idea of politics is that whenever change should be effected in the political regime, it should be done cautiously and slowly. Obviously, revolution is the exact opposite of a cautious and slow introduction of new ideas. The arrogance is seen in the way that a declaration is made from on high that should be universally accepted and adopted by every citizen. In this respect, it defies the standard political process, which entails a great deal of negotiation and compromise. And the lack of compromise in a Declaration of Human Rights is mostly what agitated Burke, because his understanding of politics was the domain, precisely the domain of compromise. Human rights are articulated as not compromisable. The idea of abstraction that Burke refers to is the way in which these declarations are made universal and instantaneous. Burke's other argument relates to the understanding of political processes under conservative political thought, which is that anything such as a right. Now, Burke was not opposed to natural rights, he strongly believed in them, but anything such as a right should evolve slowly over time and in relation to the arrogation or protection of competing rights. So we know, for example, that we have rights to freedom. What limitation is there on that right to freedom? The right to freedom is limited only by impinging on other people's rights to freedom. Stated in the abstractly, Burke says this is a meaningless concept. It means that you have the right to be free unless it violates someone else's rights to be free. So in terms of political content, what can this actually mean? Burke's argument was these are so abstract that they turn out to be meaningless, and considering the harmful revolutionary nature of the declarations, they're quite a defective way of pursuing the political aim of emancipation. Now, clearly the declaration was a moment of radical destabilization of the French, what was called Ancien Régime, or the previous regime prior to the revolutionary one. And this was a source of great concern for Burke. Will these revolutionary ideas spread to England, for example, where Burke was? And if they do spread, are they going to be spread on principles that are useful for politics, or are they going to be spread upon principles that are utopian and completely contrary to the real nature of politics? In other words, will they be spread on a universal declaration of rights that are too arrogant and abstract to really have any political traction. Another modern critique, in other words, another critique that occurs in the modern era, so the 18th century when these rights are being declared in both France and the United States. Another modern critique was put forward by the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Now Bentham, very similar to Burke, claimed that the rights that are articulated in the Universal Declaration are in complete contradiction to the compromise that is the way that politics is actually done. So when we discuss common affairs and mutual benefit, which of course a utilitarian philosopher like Bentham would be quite concerned to do, we do it in a way that negotiates between competing interests. So to declare from on high that each individual has his own personal and private interest that trumps any kind of compromise is, according to Bentham's thinking, not an advance in the way that we think about rights and politics, but a completely defective way to think about rights and politics. Everybody holds a trump card, and that's not the way that the political community generally negotiates its political compromises. You can see then that this individualism that's inherent to the idea of human rights. After all, human rights are declared as universal, but they adhere to each individual as an individual. This individualism was of grave concern to Bentham, who, as a utilitarian, preferred to see collective interest and the interests of the community over the interests of an individual, right? The utilitarian calculation, as you know, favors what interests the most number of people rather than what interests one particular person. So what part of Bentham's critique was that human rights cultivates an individualistic mentality, and in so doing, it undermines the very source of how we decide what is a morally or politically correct decision, which is to say, that which favors the most number of people. Another modern critique, a bit later than Bentham and Burke, and definitely of an entirely different political orientation, was Karl Marx's critiques of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Marx was greatly in favor of the political emancipation project that seemed to be represented through the French Revolution, but he was far more critical of whether this revolution was really one that favored all of the French people, or whether it was in fact a smaller kind of revolution of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy. So I had mentioned that the regime in France was referred to as the Ancien Régime. This regime was one where the nobility, the monarch and the noble families maintained political control. In the process of the French Revolution, the monarch and political elite were overthrown, but by whom were they overthrown? By the masses? Not at all. Marx takes great pains to point out, both historically and in terms of political philosophy, that they were overthrown by a bourgeoisie that didn't represent universal interest any better than the monarchy represented universal interest. Rather, they represented the interests of their own class. Now, the rights doctrine that derives out of the French Revolution, then, is it really, as it claims to be, in the interest of all, of the proletariat, as Marx would say, of the common working people? Marx's argument was that the articulation of human rights in the French Declaration merely served to perpetuate, in theory, what was actually happening in practice, that the revolution was favoring a particular class, and the idea of rights that are put forward in the Declaration also favor a particular class. So Marx referred to these rights, which we call universal human rights, as in fact abstract bourgeois rights. His argument was very complicated and related to his idea of capitalism and the commodity form. He drew an analogy to the way in which the commodity gets created through the claim of equal negotiations and equal contracts. So think about how any product gets produced on a factory line or by the usual processes of industry in a capitalist economy. You have the capitalist who gives capital or principal, the wealth required to start the enterprise. And that capitalist must negotiate with workers or laborers to bring the processes of production into materialization. So you have a capitalist and you have labor. The balance of power, the asymmetry of power, specifically between a very wealthy person and a common laborer who sells his body, sells his labor, is obviously not one of equality. And nevertheless, the employment contract assumes the equality of both parties to contract. So the laborer can contract his labor, and the capitalist, in exchange for the labor of the laborer, gives a salary, gives money. Now, this assumption in contract negotiations is that both parties are equal in the contract. But we know that the material situation is a great amount of inequality between the capitalist who purchases the labor of the laborer and the laborer who sells his own body, in fact, in many cases, his life, because, as you know, laborers die young, they work hard, they work themselves to sickly states and so on. These are not the sort of maladies that the capitalist who owns the plantation or factory suffers, right? The capitalist who gives money doesn't end up developing cancer, or lung cancer, or black lung, or whatever it is that all of the laborers develop in the process of carrying out a supposedly free exchange. So Marx's argument is that this imbalance, which is presented in the guise of balance, of equality, is precisely what is there in the notion of human rights. So human rights claims to articulate a moment where every single person as such is equal and free in dignity. But what's the material reality? The material reality is that society is full of an enormous amount of inequality. The more that we claim that each person may be at this moment unequal, but is inherently equal, the more we justify the asymmetry of contract. So by arguing that the laborer is fundamentally dignified, fundamentally has a right to life, and enjoys every privilege of the capitalist according to our doctrine of universal human rights, the more we support the unfair assumptions in contract that each person is in an equal bargaining position. So Marx's critique is that rights claim to be on the side of the proletariat or the masses, but in fact they support the structure of capitalism and the production of commodities, which breaks the back and stamps out the soul of the laborers and proletariat, while enriching the pockets of capitalists. If we move to critiques based on some of Marx's ideas, we come to the 20th century critiques of human rights. And many of these critiques were informed by the Marxist critique, specifically that rights claim to be for everybody, but in fact what they do is support a bourgeois structure or a capitalist system. Now, the German philosopher Hannah Arendt gave a very interesting and important reinterpretation of the message of Marx by seeing something unfold in front of her very eyes. She was a German Jew, and she had to flee Germany. She went to the United States because of the threat of internment in one of the concentration camps. And in the process, she started to write a great deal about the Second World War, about the Nazi regime. She published an enormous, important book on the origins of totalitarianism, and another book that we've discussed in other modules on Eichmann in Jerusalem, the possibility of putting people who followed Nazi law under trial, given that we have a positivistic interpretation of law. In other words, people like Eichmann, who were responsible for shipping Jews to the death camp, their defense in the trial was, I was just following the law, and it would have been wrong not to follow the law. So we've discussed Arendt in other modules in this respect. What she rights in her critique of human rights is related to these other ideas. The French Declaration was entitled The Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Why this distinction? Interestingly, these rights are assumed to be universal human rights. So every person enjoys these rights fundamentally just by virtue of being a person, not by virtue of being a king, not by virtue of being a member of the elite families, not by member of being part of the bourgeoisie. You enjoy fundamental dignity and equality just by virtue of being a person. If that is what is the content of what's being declared in a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then why this distinction between man and citizen? What it turns out is that these rights that you have by nature, just by being a human being, are only possible because you are a citizen. And Arendt says that this ambiguity in the title, Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, turned out to be fundamentally conclusive evidence that we have a deep problem in our conception of human rights. I had mentioned that she was forced to leave Germany. Well, there were thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of refugees who left Germany in the period of the Second World War. These people effectively became stateless people. Now, that means that they are not citizens. And these people were the ones who were suffering the greatest violation of what we conceive of as human rights. In other words, they had no food, they had no dignity, they had no possibility of employment, they had no shelter, they had nothing that we assume are the basic human rights that should be enjoyed by every single person. So what Arendt saw empirically was that the refugees who left and fled Europe during the war thereby became stateless. In other words, they thereby were no longer citizens. And as a consequence of their not being citizens, they lost all of their so-called human rights. So her critique of human rights in this form of the Declaration of Human Rights is a critique that attempts to distinguish between rights that we enjoy as a consequence of being members of a political community, or rights that we enjoy as a consequence of merely being human beings. And she exposed division between what we say and what we actually practice, because what's very clear is the people who need fundamental human rights more than anyone are those who are not citizens at all of any state. Later, the philosopher Giorgio Agamben resurrects Hannah Arendt's critique, mixes it with certain Marxist elements, and especially rereads human rights in a manner that takes into account what the French philosopher Michel Foucault had introduced under the title biopolitics. In other words, the way that political sovereignty in contemporary states is the forms that it takes. It takes its forms by transforming persons into populations. So reducing the richness and diversity of life as it's lived and experienced into some sort of bare life, just the flesh and blood body of the individual, who is then subject to, let's say, needs for health insurance, needs for population control, need to count how many bodies we have through the census and so on. So the idea of government turns into what Foucault referred to as governmentality, basically the process of dealing with the bare, naked bodies of the people who were supposedly citizens. Agamben's argument is to take into account Foucault's thinking and Arendt's critique of the distinction between man and citizen. And he says that the problem with human rights is that it doesn't adequately negotiate this space of the distinction between bare life, or the body, and political life. What Agamben wants to cultivate is a new conception of human rights that is a post-Foucaultian conception, one that understands that now the nature of the political regime has changed very radically from what it was in the 18th century when the French Revolution originated and put forward this conception of human rights. At that time, there was a process of governance that was decreed to be monarchic and anti-democratic. Now we have a process of government that is articulated as democratic, but which is in fact not government, but governmentality, the administration of human bodies. So Agamben's critique of human rights takes into account all of these moments and suggests that we need a radically new conception. To change from these critiques that have primarily arisen in continental Europe, Burke's critique, Bentham's critique, Hannah Arendt and Agamben and so on, another large body of the philosophical resistance to the idea of human rights arises in the post-colonial world. We call these post-colonial critiques of human rights. Post-colonial critiques of human rights have a very interesting possible origin. So not so much occurring in the hypocrisy of the declaration of the 18th century rights, because when countries like the US or France declared these universal human rights, they were still enjoying slavery and imperial conquest. It's not so much this hypocrisy of the 18th century that grounds several of the post-colonial critiques of human rights, but rather something that happened more recently. And that is that building upon the 18th century and as a consequence of the wars that devastated Europe, the United Nations put forward the need for a universal declaration of human rights that would be assented to by every country that was a party of the United Nations. This took form as what's known as the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, of course, a document which we all respect and admire. But in order to ensure that this Declaration of Human Rights was, in fact, a universal declaration, since all of its authors were primarily European, the committee that was drafting the articles of the declaration would send out questionnaires all over the world. They sent several questionnaires to India, to China, to Africa, asking prominent philosophers and politicians what they thought about the universality of human rights. So, for example, Humayun Kabir was asked by this drafting committee, do you find within Indian traditions, Hindu and other traditions, some semblance of human rights or proto-human rights? And if so, can you articulate what they are so that we can assume or assimilate a little bit of that momentum to make our Declaration of Human Rights truly universal? Well, one of the people to whom the drafting committee sent a request, not necessarily for this kind of information, but for endorsement, was, of course, to Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was asked to endorse the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that had been drafted, and intriguingly, Gandhi refused to do so. His fundamental argument was that while he appreciated what was the attempt in drafting a Declaration of Human Rights, his concern is that it privileges the rights of each individual, conceived individually and atomistically, over the duties that we all have to our common brotherhood. So Gandhi refused to endorse the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as a consequence, there are several post-colonial theorists who continue a tradition or trend of critiquing human rights, partly from Gandhi's argument, and partly, of course, from the very hypocrisy of the 18th century, which is to say that they declare these human rights as universal while denying them in practice to every person who lives in a colony. Now, the post-colonial critics, foremost names in this are Ratna Kapoor, Upendra Bakshi, and Gayatri Spivak. They've each offered alternative kinds of critiques and nuanced critiques. Ratna Kapoor focuses on what she refers to as the dark side of human rights. So for her critique, human rights is a very admirable project, but it produces externalities that she refers to as a dark side. What she identifies as a sort of vigilantism and a overzealousness in the pursuit of spotting, identifying human rights violations and correcting them. And her argument is that usually the way that this plays out on the international scene is that it is Europeans who identify rights violations occurring in non-Europe, in the post-colonies. And as a consequence, Kapoor attempts to link precisely the same hypocrisy of the 18th century and the processes of colonialization to the way that it is primarily Europe that is championing human rights internationally now. Gayatri Spivak puts an interesting spin on this by putting it very frankly. She said human rights take shape as white men saving brown women from brown men. So her critique is a deconstructive one, where she argues that the utopian articulation of human rights as being universal and enjoyed by all actually dissolve into a particularist conception where the white man, as usual, gets to regulate everything that happens on the globe. Now, as a result of these sorts of post-colonial critiques of human rights, the argument is made between a claimed universal and the actual particularist practices. So the remedy for this problem inherent to human rights and the way that the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, gets implemented around the world, the remedy, according to post-colonial theorists, is for the fake universality to match the real particularity. So in other words, if we're going to discuss human rights, then we need to be informed about this, not from bureaucrats in continental Europe enjoying privileged lives, but rather we need to be informed by those who live life on the margin, whose lives are at risk and whose rights are perpetually vulnerable. So they want to, the main argument of the post-colonial theorists is to eliminate the hypocritical false universality, and if we're going to pursue a real legitimate human rights project, then the people who should be teaching us about human rights are not the privileged academics and scholars and politicians and so on, but the very people whose rights are violated 24 hours a day. Well, human rights is, of course, considered a fundamentally liberal philosophical position, but there are also liberal philosophical critiques of human rights. Two of the most important are put forward by the American pragmatist Richard Rorty and the Canadian political theorist Michael Ignatieff. What Rorty and Ignatieff more or less have put forward is a way to circumvent this huge number of critiques that we've been dealing with. So liberals themselves know that the liberal project of human rights is under threat from post-colonial criticism, from continental criticism, post-Foucaultian, Agamben, from Marxist critique, and from conservative critique. So the liberals are attacked on all sides. The way to pursue the human rights project, according to this pragmatic liberal thinking, then, is to give in to some of the complaints. So let's reduce the idea of human rights from being a universal, since we in fact do know that empirically it's just a projection of the privileged white European male. Let's remove this false claim to universality and make human rights a very minimalist conception. So what this is referred to is as human rights as the most we can hope for. So this is the expression. Instead of some grandiose universal declaration, we'll reconceive human rights as the most we can hope for. And then what is this hope based upon? It's based upon a very sentimental, pragmatic foundation, not some kind of abstract, inalienable, innate right, but rather the fact that we're all sympathetic to suffering. So we really reduce the philosophical thickness of the concept of human rights and bring it down to from a level of inalienability and intellectuality and utopianism to just the most we can hope for, considering that people are very bad and we don't like to see people suffer. This is the argument put forward by Rorty. But these arguments of the liberals have themselves been subject to a kind of imminent critique. One of the most important critiques is that by the philosopher Wendy Brown. Wendy Brown criticizes this minimalist liberal rearrangement of human rights because she argues that, very similar to what Marx had identified, that when we remove real issues to a realm of sentimentality or charity, or we all feel sorry, what we have the possibility of doing is secretly attempting to establish an order whereby capitalism can flourish more adequately. So if you put it into the way Ignatieff suggests we need to conduct our human rights, basically, let's stop giving a robust, thick, moralizing conception and in fact just concentrate on making sure people's rights aren't violated so there is stability and security in the world. Well, Wendy Brown says, then what do you really want in thinning out your robust conception of human rights? Are you really interested in the liberation and emancipation of those who suffer on the margins throughout the world? Or isn't it in fact the case that as a liberal political philosopher, the economic background that you support is capitalism, and what you're really trying to do is create a stable, secure environment for capitalism to thrive? So Wendy Brown's critique of the liberal attempt to rescue human rights from criticism is to add more criticism upon the liberal contempt, which is that all along you've been pursuing a policy of human rights in theory and in practice, just trying to enrich Europe. In other words, the transatlantic world, Europe and the United States. In other words, claiming that if this country commits a human rights violation, then we won't trade with it, or other kinds of regulations of the international order that pretend to be interested in the people, but are in fact expropriating labor or wealth and doing those sorts of capitalist violations of people's fundamental dignity that you claim to be opposed to. So Brown has leveled that critique onto the liberal attempt to rescue human rights from other critiques. Now, finally, we'll close with the most contemporary critique of human rights, one that was articulated most clearly in 2010 and in the recent works of several European philosophers whom we can call post-Althusserian. By post-Althusserian, what we mean is that these are a number of philosophers who were students of the great Marxist theoretician Louis Althusser. So Jacques Rancière was a student of Althusser, Etienne Balibar, and Slavoj Žižek, while not a student of Althusser, was deeply influenced by Althusser's thought. So we refer to this final contemporary critique of human rights as the post-Althusserian critique of human rights. I'm going to talk primarily about Žižek. So Slavoj Žižek has put forward one of the most crisp and clear critiques of human rights in a paper that he entitled very plainly, Against Human Rights. Now, the ironic thing about Žižek's position and the post-Althusserian position is they're not really against human rights. In fact, what they're interested in is not the hypocrisy of human rights being corrected in the manner that post-colonial theorists argue that it should. The false universality should be dismissed and we should concentrate on particularity. Rather, the post-Althusserian position is human rights should continue to be hypocritical. They should continue to be false universals. Now, why would they say something like this? Their argument is that it's always been universals that have driven radical change. So we never would have made progress in history towards the emancipation of, let's say, women's liberation, if there wasn't already articulated a hypocritical universal. In other words, if we've declared that all men have the right to vote, that universal, which is being denied to a particular, in this case, women, has been precisely, that hypocrisy is precisely the moment that sparks political agitation amongst women. So why shouldn't women also have the right to vote if all men enjoy that universally? Right? You remember that in history there was a moment when only the aristocrats or property owners can vote, and then that was changed to what was called universal suffrage. Universal suffrage was, in fact, the right of all men to vote, irrespective of property. It didn't matter if they had property or not, all men could vote. But in that sense, it was a false universal, because men aren't the paradigm of humankind, right? They're only one gender among another or others. So that false universality is precisely what got women to recognize that this hypocrisy needs to be addressed. If all men have the right to vote, then why not women too? So Žižek's argument is that it's precisely the hypocrisy that we need, because if we didn't have hypocrisy, we wouldn't have political agitation. And this kind of hypocrisy of false universal declarations, the post-Althusserians refer to as symbolic efficiency. So there's an efficiency of its own, there's a logic of its own in the symbolic aspect of a hypocritical declaration. So the post-colonial position is that we should annihilate the hypocrisy of this declaration and concentrate on the particulars. The post-Althusserian differs slightly, that let's sustain the hypocrisy of the false universal so that the particulars rise to the universal. And this is the post-Althusserian critique of human rights. So as we've seen, from the moment of the Declaration of Human Rights until today, human rights, as much as we favor them as a political practice, have been critiqued from various political philosophical angles. And the kinds of critiques that have been leveled have depended upon the historical circumstances and upon the ideology of the particular political philosopher who puts forward the critique. Thank you.